All right. Well, thank you. And welcome everyone to the co-managing CDBG-CV and CDBG-DR session. And thank you especially for being willing to do this at 4 o'clock on a Friday, for those of you on Eastern time. So this is going to be a bit of a strategic look of how to manage CV and DR together, what their similarities are, how they differ. So if we could go on to the next slide. So a touch of housekeeping. Those of you who've been doing this all week know most of this stuff. So the PowerPoints are going to go up on the HUD Exchange. All the participants will be in listen-only mode, so we won't be able to hear your dog bark. Closed captions can be used during the show captions feature below the video player. And there's more information in the attendee guide, which is available on the resources page of the event website. Okay, next. We're ready for the next slide. There we go, questions. Okay, so do things a little bit differently than at least I've done before on these. So submit your questions under the Q&A feature right below the video, or you also can use the Slido app if you want. And you're encouraged to submit questions throughout the presentation. You don't need to wait to the end. We're going to try to work them into the presentation as we go. But we'd also like for you to vote on the questions you think are most important that you'd like to discuss by hitting a little thumbs up sign next to the question when they show up. And with the very least, Randall and I, because we know we're limited on time, we'll try and answer the questions to get the most thumbs up votes. If you've got technical issues, please use the chat box on the right side of the screen. You can also email eventsupport@sitemgroup.com. So if something's not working, you can't ask a question or anything like that. Those are the technical kind of issues you would want to send to use the chat box for. All right. And we can keep going.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. My name's Randall Mullen, and I'm Vice President of TDA Consulting. On behalf of the Office of Block Grant Assistance at HUD, I want to welcome you formally to this webinar on co-managing CDBG-CV and DR. Next slide. As you know, Stan Fitterman and I are delivering this webinar, and Stan is the president of SFF Consulting Group, and I'm with TDA Consulting. We are pleased to repeat the delivery of this training, which actually was offered earlier in the season in this past November. And so we are pleased to repeat the delivery of the webinar during the virtual CARES Act conference. Before we make this presentation and address your questions, I would like to provide a brief overview. Next slide. You might ask yourself, well, why this topic as part of the Basically CDBG course at the virtual conference? In recent years, communities across the nation have been impacted by a wide variety of major disasters. Over 60 communities are recovering from such disasters while also responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. This unprecedented convergence of events presents extraordinary challenges, but also significant opportunities. HUD has awarded most of those communities large CDBG-DR grants, as well as CDBG-CV funding. And many grantees might want to co-manage both programs. As Stan suggested, strategically, it makes sense to manage the programs in a coordinated fashion. But how can that be effectively accomplished? I'll begin the webinar with a preview of our agenda, which seeks to answer that question. Next slide. This afternoon, we'll describe both the similarities and differences between CDBG-DR and CDBG-CV programs. Stan and I will describe the typical activities that both states and local governments have undertaken with grant funds. We will also identify a variety of opportunities to strategically manage the programs in that coordinated and effective manner. And as time permits, Stan mentioned, we will attempt to answer your questions, which you post in the chat. And again, to ensure that the most frequently asked questions are answered at the end, we've asked you to like or upvote a question that might be similar to the one you also have. And lastly, we will identify the available resources that are on the HUD Exchange for your use. Stan will now begin our presentation by describing the similarities between CDBG-DR and CDBG-CV.
All right, thank you, Randall. Yeah, that's a good slide to be on, thank you. So what are the similarities? Well, they're both what they call built on the CDBG chassis, right? So basically, it's CDBG money with an attitude. The attitude comes in that there are waivers that HUD has issued in a Federal Register notice that takes some of the CDBG rules and make them not applicable to DR or CV. For example, with CDBG-CV, one of the waivers is the 15% cap on public services has been waived, has been eliminated. So when you're spending money, CDBG-CV money, you don't have to worry about that cap. Other things, though, that are consistent with the CDBG rules and the CDBG rules have to be followed for both CDBG-CV and DR. Both are a response to an emergency. DR is responsible for disasters, fires, hurricanes, flooding. CV is a public health response to a public health emergency. Built on the CDBG chassis means national objectives must be met. So it's either got to meet a low mod housing, low mod area, low mod clientele, slum and blight. Yeah, not so much with CV perhaps, but definitely one of the national objectives for CDBG. And everyone's favorite, cross-cutting federal regulations are going to apply. So you've got environmental review if you're triggering it. You've got lead-based paint if you're triggering it. You've got Uniform Relocation Act if you're triggering it, and the fair housing stuff as well. Okay. Next. All right, so more similarities. So both have duplication of benefits applies. So duplication of benefits, if you missed the session this morning that Jennifer Alpha and I did at 9 a.m., it occurs when a person, household, business, government, or other entity receives assistance from multiple sources for the same purpose, for the same time frame, and the total assistance received is more than the need. So let's do a DR example. Someone's got $100,000 worth of repairs. They get $90,000 from insurance. You had told them you're going to do $20,000. That would be a duplication of benefits. You're giving them $10,000 more than they need for the repairs. Both have tieback. CDBG-DR, all activities must address an impact, direct or indirect, from the disaster and a presidentially declared disaster in the presidentially declared area. CV has to be used to prevent, prepare for, or respond to coronavirus. And as we talked about before on a slide ago, the Federal Register notices list waivers from the regular CDBG requirements. So there are things that are, like we said, the public service cap, elimination of the public service cap for CV is an example. In CDBG-DR, new constructions allowed, not allowed in plain old CDBG. All right, and now Randall, we got the similarities. Now it's Randall's turn to tell us about the differences.
Okay, thanks, Stan. While both CDBG-DR and CDBG-CV must tie back to the significant events, as Stan mentioned, the requirements are slightly different. A CDBG-DR funded recovery program must respond to the types, locations of needs resulting from the disaster's direct or indirect impact, specifically the most impacted and distressed areas. And the planned response is described in a needs assessment, which quantifies the disaster's impact and estimates the cost of recovery. A grantee identifies in funding that gaps in funding that can be filled with the use of the CDBG-DR grant. Related recovery activities are then designed to meet those unmet needs based upon that assessment and public comments. A grantee publishes its action plan and ties the recovery activities to the detailed needs assessment. Next slide. No comprehensive needs assessment is required, though, for CDBG-CV. Because of the ongoing nature of the pandemic, it's not possible to fully quantify the event's direct and indirect impacts, nor estimate the total cost of recovery. The CARES Act requires that each CDBG-CV funded activity must, quote, prevent, prepare for, and respond to the coronavirus. In its action plan, a grantee simply identifies planned activities for use of grant allocations, follows an expedited public comment process, and then submits a substantial amendment to HUD. Subsequently, the grantee provides documentation which ties back to widespread impacts of the coronavirus, and as Stan explained, takes specific steps to prevent any duplication of benefits from related financial assistance. Now Stan will begin to describe the typical activities that both states and local governments have undertaken with grant funds in the two programs.
All right, so let's start with DR. So eligible activities that tie back to the disaster for which the funds were appropriated. Often this includes rehab and new construction. In most federal DR, Federal Register notices, there's a waiver that permits new construction. Often communities will also do public facilities and improvements. So sometimes infrastructure was damaged. Sometimes buildings, senior centers or such were damaged by the event. So as per a regular CDBG, those are eligible. They're eligible under DR. Public services for DR is sometimes also funded. More rarely, special economic development activities, although Puerto Rico is putting or had originally put a bunch of money into economic development activities with their DR funds. Then, of course, there's also administration and planning. Okay, next. Okay, so trying to get to my notes here. Okay, so how is DR used? Well, the Federal Register notice governing DR funds generally require grantees to primarily address unmet housing needs. So that is the focus of DR typically. It may also fund, repair, or reconstruct public facilities, as we discussed, including features to increase resiliency. And that's a little bit of a difference, if I could do a quick aside, than like FEMA. FEMA wants you to build it back as it was. With DR, you can build it back in a way that increases the resiliency. So if it's in a floodplain, you could elevate it to get it out of the floodplain. A certain percentage of every grant must be expended for low-mod households or in low-mod income persons. Often that is 70%, just like the regular CDBG. In other cases, it's been a little lower, but it seems like HUD is moving toward keeping it closer to that 70%. Okay. Oh, and so, all right. So now Randall will describe how CDBG-CV funds are typically used.
Okay, Stan. The CDBG-CV funds may be used for CDBG eligible activities that you have covered in the earlier parts of this virtual conference, so long as they tie back to the pandemic, again, to prevent, prepare for, and respond to COVID-19. To date, the most typical activities of those funded by CV grants include public service activities, specifically emergency payments to be covered on the next slide, economic development activities, as well as housing-related activities, public improvements and facilities, real property acquisition, and of course, general administrative and planning activities. Activities must benefit residents within the jurisdiction of the grantee. And I want to clarify that these jurisdictions are both local governments, which are entitlement communities, as well as state grantees that, thanks to added flexibility in the CDBG-CV program, can actively cooperate with their smaller cities and even entitlement jurisdictions. So what we're describing here is the potential to strategically manage these programs in a manner that goes well beyond the CDBG program. Yet, at least 70% of every grant must be expended for activities that benefit low and moderate income persons by providing, say, a public service, housing, access to new or significantly improved infrastructure, or a permanent job. The remaining 30% may be used to eliminate slums or blighted conditions, or to address an urgent need for which the grantee certifies it has no other funding. Next slide. As with the CDBG-DR program, HUD has issued special guidance through a Federal Register notice. You may remember it was published in August 2020. The notice implements features on the CARES Act intended to enhance flexibility, as Stan earlier mentioned, in response to COVID-19. Certain CDBG-funded activities can be carried out with the added flexibility necessary to address the dangerous nature and extensive scope of the pandemic. Let's take a look at the alternative requirements that permit such flexibility for three types of activity: emergency grant payments, business assistance, and micro enterprises. Next slide. Under this category of public services, CDBG-CV funds can be used to make emergency payments, as many grantees have done across the nation. And some of you actually may have participated in one of the basically CDBG sessions that focused on public services and devoted attention to this particular use. Those emergency payments have covered such items as food, clothing, housing, that is rent or mortgage, as well as utilities. Stan and I have noted, however, that recently the housing-related payments have begun to shift from rent to mortgage payments. But the payments must be made to a provider, such as a utility company, on behalf of the individual or family. The simple table you see on this slide indicates a related alternative requirement, which permits emergency payments under CDBG-CV for up to 6 consecutive months. That is, instead of the 3 consecutive months permitted by CDBG. It's also important to note that the public services cap, as Stan earlier mentioned, which limits spending on public services to 15% of CDBG resources, is completely waived for CDBG-CV. There is no such spending limitation on public services expenditures from a CDBG-CV grant. Next slide. CDBG-CV funds have also been widely used for both business assistance and microenterprise assistance. Business assistance, it's typically offered to avoid job losses caused by business closures related to social distancing. Short-term working capital is provided to businesses, small businesses in particular, to enable them to retain jobs held by low and moderate income persons, or maybe to retrofit their place of business to recover from the pandemic. Businesses comprised of 5 or fewer employees have received technical assistance as well as help to establish, stabilize, or expand micro enterprises. Such businesses often provide medical, food delivery, cleaning, and other services to support home health in quarantine. Now that we've reviewed the typical activities that grantees either have undertaken or can undertake with CDBG-DR and CDBG-CV funds, Stan will start to identify a variety of opportunities we see to strategically manage the programs in a coordinated and effective manner.
All right, thank you, Randall. So we're going to start out by looking at some specific activities, a little more detail of how they're structured, and then kind of merge into how those perhaps can be combined and these two programs can work together. So DR activities, as we said, first, it's foremost is to address unmet housing needs. Rehab of damaged units, waiver allows new construction. buy out programs where you're actually buying out the home of the folks, usually at pre-storm value, and public facilities improvements, repair, reconstruction, rebuild to become more resilient. All right, next. So let's look at CV activities. A lot of folks have been using CV to address homelessness, either on the public facilities or the public services side, and also to promote economic recovery, business assistance, small scale business assistance loans and grants, technical support and services for businesses and microenterprise, and as well as Randall mentioned, microenterprise assistance, doing both of the above. Okay, next. All right, so let's look at some examples for public facilities. There's been a lot of emphasis lately on non-congregate, well, really since the pandemic began. It's been a lot longer than I guess I care to remember. Focus on non-congregate emergency shelters. So instead of having folks all in one place, buying hotels or motels to house people experiencing homelessness. There's also been some temporary hotel motel sheltering programs. California started its efforts with Project Room Key, that some of you are from California may be familiar with, where they were paying to put folk who were in the congregate shelters, they were paying to put them up into temporary hotels and motels. And there's also the opportunity to have emergency payments prioritized for homeless or those at risk of becoming homeless. So he's recently exited from a HUD-funded rapid rehousing or currently in permanent supportive housing with inadequate rental assistance. So they're in a place where they could be able to afford it. Normally, COVID, the pandemic may have resulted in them in losing income. As a result, they're at risk of losing the permanent supportive housing they need. So prioritizing those type of things is something that some communities have done. All right, next. So let's look at two examples of CDBG for homelessness, California and King County, Washington. California initially paid for rooms. They now are on their second round and they're using some CV. They use some CV for this as well as other sources, but they're funding nonprofits and local governments for the purchase of hotels to be converted to either interim housing. So it would be a non-congregate shelter where people don't have leases and stay in as a bit of an emergency situation, and often also permanent housing. So permanent supportive housing where folks would have a lease and have a place to live as long as they follow the rules. Not typically, they are requiring housing first in this, so that housing is a tool to help people recover from whatever they're dealing with, as opposed to as a reward for people who have already been able to recover. I think an interesting fact, University of Washington did kind of study a little bit early on in the pandemic of King County's program, and they concluded that the non-congregate shelters limited the spread of COVID-19 versus those that stayed in congregate setting. Knowing what we know now about how it's transmitted, that makes sense. It resulted in higher exits to permanent housing from hotels than the congregate stay. And there was indications of greater engagement with homeless housing services. So it does seem to, not only from a public health standpoint, it also seemed to kind of getting folks out of a congregate shelter also benefited them in moving on to permanent housing and getting services they might need to get there. Okay, next. Okay, so with CDBG-CV for homeless, we increased, there is no public services cap for CV. So the public service agency funding could increase the number of rental assistance applicants that can be processed. Another example was to broaden the range of services to include food programs. The state of Vermont for a while was paying restaurants, giving people up to $10 to buy food at a restaurant. I thought that was a great double benefit. It kept the restaurants in business. It also provided food for folks that needed it. All right, now Randall is going to talk about describe opportunities that aid in economic recovery.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Yes, in the prior section, we covered opportunities that address housing and community development needs in response to the pandemic that were often exacerbated by recovery from past or recent natural disasters. So I am now going to focus on those opportunities that aid in the economic recovery that is ahead of us. Early in the pandemic, HUD did recognize the significant public benefit derived from the provision of assistance to stabilize and sustain businesses in jurisdictions that suffered disruption due to coronavirus. The guidance in the Federal Register notice that I mentioned earlier on CDBG-CV, it sought to facilitate business assistance for the purpose of avoiding a complete economic collapse within a grantee's jurisdiction. And now we are turning our attention to focusing on economic recovery. Therefore, CDBG-CV is more targeted to small-scale economic development activities than CDBG-DR. Examples include the business assistance services and microenterprises that target central business districts, CBDs, in a local jurisdiction. Expand goods and services to a jurisdiction's core that might be underserved. And then create business incubators that capture markets demanding new and different services as a result of the pandemic that we're experiencing. Next slide. HUD did establish a waiver and alternative requirements to facilitate and expedite assistance to businesses affected by the pandemic by streamlining the national objective criteria and record-keeping requirements for activities that benefit low and moderate income persons by retaining or creating jobs. Those of you who attended earlier sessions on economic development or on national objectives have been through the specific guidance that applies and the somewhat burdensome record-keeping requirements that have existed for CDBG. This slide describes a so-called location presumption of LMI status for job creation and retention, which actually enables jurisdictions to better assist economic recovery in central business districts. As you see, the higher poverty rate for CBDs is removed, and qualifying census tracts must meet either the 70% LMI requirement or the 20% poverty rate of evidence of poverty and general distress to serve those areas. Next slide. As you also may know, normal job creation and retention record-keeping requirements, they consider family income when determining whether a beneficiary is a person of low or moderate income. But these requirements are likely to be burdensome during a time when unemployment has surged and family income is more difficult to document. Collection of income information directly from assisted businesses streamlines the assistance. Grantees and an employer may consider individuals that apply for or hold jobs to be members of one-person families for activities that prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus. HUD has also modified the related record-keeping requirements by adding the following presumption. HUD will consider the person income qualified if the annual wages or salary of the job is equal to or less than the Section 8 low-income limit established by HUD for a one-person family. And the business may substitute records showing the type of job and the annual wages or salary of the job. The upshot of these alternative requirements is that it becomes easier for a jurisdiction to offer assistance to businesses that will either retain or create jobs available to low and moderate income persons. Next slide. Also, an alternative requirement modifies the so-called public benefit test. Again, if you attended the earlier sessions on economic development, you know about that test for CDBG-CV funded jobs, it's different. Ordinarily, under CDBG, the test examines both aggregate and individual benefits. The aggregate being for the entire program of economic development, and individual benefits being those that are enjoyed by the business that receives assistance. HUD waived the aggregate benefit test entirely and raised the individual benefit test. Specifically, the cost per full-time equivalent, or FTE job, is a maximum of $85,000, as shown on this table. And the alternative also provides similar flexibilities for the provision of goods and services. Whatever the community development needs, a grantee can identify opportunities to separately use both CDBG and CDBG funds. Those related activities actually might complement each other or more fully address an established need. Stan will now take this approach a step further.
All right, thank you, Randall. Okay, so why would you even want to do this, right? Why fund some type of activity with both grants? Well, it's possible that needs changed between the natural disaster and pandemic. We'll look at an example in a minute on the next slide of some case studies and best practices. Conditions may have evolved during the pandemic to where there are different needs now that CDBG-CV could cover. Let's face it, program design elements, policies, and procedures are similar. It's, as we've been saying, it's on the CD built, they're both based on CDBG. So our staff capabilities are going to be similar. They have to understand duplication of benefits for both, have to understand national objectives for both, have to understand eligible activities for both. So we've got staff in place that could potentially manage both. And if we're funding a public facility, for instance, with both CDBG-DR and CV, we know how much money is coming from each source, so we can have a better way of managing the duplication of benefit aspect of the programs. Okay, next slide, please. So what are some best examples? CV funded emergency payments for rental assistance to those that are at risk of homelessness, especially who are living in rental units that were repaired with DR. We don't want to repair a rental development with DR and then have it start to have cash flow problems because their tenants can't pay the rent because of issues related to the pandemic. We can prioritize DR funded repair developments to ensure immediate viability of affordable development. So we can have DR funded repaired improvements, and so that we have an opportunity to get folks into rental housing they can afford. Emergency mortgage payments could be prioritized for applicants to receive DR funded repairs. Again, we don't want to have the risk of a DR funded repair and then have someone lose their home because they couldn't afford to pay their mortgage because they lost their job because of COVID. Expand DR funded business working capital to include CV funded rent payments. Remember, with business assistance programs, we could pay the rent for a business. So if we've given them working capital to try and get their themselves back up into play and back operating after a disaster, and now they're struggling to pay rent because their customers are pausing, then you've got an opportunity to pay rent for them till hopefully we can get things back to a little bit closer to normal. You can also add, and I know Colorado Springs did this, they added CDBG funded microenterprise technical assistance, and they did it without DR, but it certainly is something that you can do to existing funded DR programs, existing funded assistance programs as well. Okay, next slide, please. All right, how to maintain a compliance. Well, duplication of benefits. If we're funding it with, to avoid increase the size or scope of an existing DR funded activity with CV funds because the need has increased. So an example of this, a public facility that was damaged by a disaster, you were planning to rebuild it. Now you also realize that a better HVAC system that has more ventilation, or they may have the UVGI or a HEPA filters may be now something that would make sense. So you would expand the scope of the DR repairs to include some CDBG-CV funded additional repairs to the HVAC system, for example. Supplanting. So we're just throwing this in because it's a good idea to cover. You can't reduce state or local funds for an activity because now you have federal funds. So if you already had budgeted something like in a capital improvements program, like improved drainage of a certain road, and now DR money is available, you can't go, oh no, we're going to pull the local money and now use DR. If it was budgeted for it, that would be supplanting, and we can't do that. Okay. Monitors and OIG get very grumpy when we supplant. All right, and now we're going to conclude with an example of co-managing DR and CV programs with an example from Puerto Rico that Randall is going to walk us through.
Okay, Stan. Yes, among the best examples are those designed to foster economic recovery. In disaster-impacted areas that received CDBG-DR funds, business needs, as you noted, likely have changed between when a CDBG-DR action plan was written and the beginning of the pandemic, officially January 21, 2020. Affected businesses may need more working capital or rent assistance than contemplated when the CDBG-DR program was established. Also, the type and size of businesses affected by the pandemic is more varied and widespread than only those impacted by the previous disaster. As such, grantees have chosen to use CDBG-CV to assist a wider variety of small businesses, microenterprises, and more than the large-scale initiatives to support economic revitalization through the DR program. In October 2020, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico amended its action plan to allocate CDBG-CV grant funding for a microenterprise assistance program in response to COVID-19. Municipalities provide assistance through grants to eligible microenterprises for medical, food delivery, cleaning, and other services to support home health. The program complements larger scale economic development activities funded by CDBG-DR grants, which are administered by the territorial government to support economic revitalization and recovery from disasters caused by Hurricanes Irma and Maria of 2017. Next slide. Okay, it's now time for us to address questions that may have been raised in the chat. And if you haven't already, please take time to upvote on questions you'd like most to be answered by Stan and myself, and we'll be sure to get to them. We have a little over 20 minutes left. And so do we have any
It looks
questions?
like looks like the 4 o'clock on a Friday is doing us wrong. We don't have any questions.
All right, well, if there are no, I did notice one question early on, which asked whether this session is aimed particularly to entitlement communities or to state grantees. And it's actually aimed to both, because each has been actively involved in both disaster recovery and in CDBG-CV programs that respond to the pandemic. So we would hope that you will thoughtfully think about how to strategically manage the resources, especially as we pivot from the public health crisis to the economic recovery. Lastly, on this Friday afternoon, we did want to identify the available resources on the HUD Exchange. Stan, what are the resources that we want to list on the next slide?
I'm so glad you asked. So quick guides, co-managing disaster recovery and CARES Act program. Randall and I wrote it, so it is one of the best quick guides you'll ever come across. But in all seriousness, another one that I think has been extremely useful is the PPR tieback, the for COVID for CV, the tieback flexibilities. And that really provided some clear direction on things that are um, uh, that are available for ways to do tieback flexibility. For instance, it clarified that you can do owner-occupied rehab or rental rehab with and what the conditions are, whether it's fixing things that lead to a worse outcome from COVID, such as mold, lead-based paint. You could fix HVAC systems so they're better, have better better ventilation, or UVGI, as we discussed. Duplication of benefits. That's super important for DR and is really an issue for DR because often with CDBG-DR, folks had insurance and FEMA access to FEMA funds as well. It's important in CV where some of the issues are coming up where two organizations, two grantees with covering the same geographic area are both implementing the same program, such as a county or a state emergency rental assistance program, while the city is also implementing one as well. So again, that's also a good quick guide for CDBG-CV. There's also a bunch of webinars out there, one on economic development strategies that's very good, subrecipient management, especially if you're new to the program. I think the subrecipient management one really walks you through, give guys very good guidance on some of the things you need to pay attention to when you're dealing with subrecipients. And I think last, there is the opportunity for CDBG-DR and CV on-call technical assistance you request through the HUD exchange. And while not on here, I wanted to add that there is also the Ask a Question desk that many of us, Randall and I, and Rob, who just joined us, are all on answering questions. So you can get your question answered within a couple of days is the goal. And that also is a good resource. And here's the links for some of the resources. And if you go to HUD Exchange and search for CDBG-CV, you will also find these things as well. But these will be posted when the PowerPoint is posted.
Stan, before we close the webinar, I would like to note that we have received a few questions, and perhaps we can take time to answer these three questions. The first is fairly specific, and it is, how is emergency payments related to food and clothing for CDBG? The public services category of eligible activities does permit emergency payments for more than rental assistance or for mortgage assistance. It does permit the purchase of food or clothing for people who are facing emergency circumstances. And it is on that basis that, for example, food banks are frequently operated as a place to distribute food, but it is possible to also directly provide through an intermediary, such as a food bank, food or clothing to those who are urgently in need of such commodities. Stan, we also have a question that's a more general nature, and that is, could we talk about the coordination and collaboration partnerships that we foresee as being key to administering these programs, particularly given the DR funds are awarded to states? And it occurs to me that while it is true that most DR funds are awarded to states, there are some exceptions to that rule. Where there are those exceptions, it is possible for the coordination to occur more cohesively between, say, an entitlement community that is receiving both funding sources. But it's also important to recognize that the added flexibility of the state CDBG-CV program is that states can directly administer. They can also enter into memoranda of agreements with jurisdictions that are actually entitlement communities and use that vehicle as a basis for coordinating both the response to the pandemic with their CV funds, as well as a CDBG-DR recovery program from a disaster of some kind.
Yeah, and I guess I'll add that from what I've seen and working with folks is that some of the reality is a lot of it's going to depend on what your working relationship is with your state government and
True.
with the entity within state government that is implementing the DR program. Sometimes they very much are interested in listening to you saying, hey, if you tell us who the DR funded rental deals are in our community, we'll prioritize them to make sure they're not going to go have cash flow problems because folks can't pay their rent. In other cases, sometimes they're not as cooperative. So I think to me, that's been one of the keys is how well the local government gets along with the state government.
Correct. And we have a related question. Would an entitlement community need to receive DR funds in order to initiate some of the programs that we have mentioned, particularly, say, an incubator medical personnel that may want to obtain upskilling? The answer is no. In fact, the Puerto Rico example involves the Commonwealth, which as a territorial government like a state receives the DR funding. But they have also received CV funding and enabled the municipalities to undertake the microenterprise program that, among other things, can provide medical services within the municipal areas of Puerto Rico. And as such, it's a coordinated approach to utilizing the two sources of funding in a strategic fashion to meet both the public health crisis needs and to continue the ongoing economic recovery from the hurricanes of 2017. What other questions do we have, Stan?
Let's see. Could you please provide additional examples of projects that could involve DR and CV funds?
There are additional examples in the guide that you referenced earlier. We would also urge you to take a look at a recent, a notice that came out a few years ago from CPD. It is on the HUD Exchange and entitled Using CPD Funds for Disaster Response and Recovery. I urge you to take a look at that guide because what it helps a grantee understand is where they are simply receiving CDBG funds, how they can use those funds to complement a disaster response and recovery. The same principles and examples that appear in that guide are also available to you under CDBG-CV with the added flexibilities. So in our viewpoint, there are a plethora of examples where a jurisdiction wants to particularly think strategically and attempt to co-manage the programs where they very likely have limited staff and capabilities to deal with all of the different demands for managing and delivering grant-related services from HUD. There is also a separate resource that I'll mention that will offer a few other ideas too, and it is a HUD Community Resilience Toolkit. As you probably know, HUD is urging communities struck by the disasters of a natural type, as well as this public health disaster, to think ahead and identify ways that their communities can be more resilient if there were another pandemic, or if there is, as we can all expect, yet another hurricane to strike the islands. This toolkit offers useful strategies for coordinating the different sources of funding in such a way as to build back better and enable us to better withstand future challenges that are caused by either a public health crisis, a natural disaster, or some other kind of catastrophe.
All right.
Are there any other questions, Stan?
I don't see any. Looking at the Slido to see if there's any I missed.
Okay, well, given that we are within 10 minutes of the end of this time block and it is Friday afternoon, I'll just conclude by.
We got one more. If we
do? Okay, what is it?
Yeah, sorry everybody for that little tease of getting out early. If we had a small business program and gave funding to the small business at the time they were eligible, what happens if small business went out of business? Can we still count this small business and IDIS and use the CDBG-CV funding?
To me, that's a question you would probably want to direct to your local HUD office. There is a recognition that small business assistance is a risky endeavor, and that grants or loans provided to businesses may not be used as intended. If there was an expectation to repay that assistance, there are frequently defaults. And if your programs, policies, and procedures has called for you as the grantee to attempt to collect on that assistance, and you have made those good faith efforts, and it is still necessary to write off that assistance, you will be allowed to do so. It's a matter of exercising the prudence that's required for an economic development program such as small business assistance, and certainly an observation made by your local field office that you have made good faith efforts to properly administer the program and follow your policies and procedures, and where possible, collect grant funds that have not been used as intended. Do you want to add anything to that?
Only that there is an FAQ where HUD does address this, and note that if you underwrote the loan, you did what you, as Randall said, you did what you could to make sure they were going to be able to stay in business, and they still went under and weren't able to maintain the job or create the job, that there is the opportunity for the field office to be able to work with you. You show them that what you did, your good faith effort to do due diligence to make sure they were going to stay in business, and they have the ability to, for lack of a better word, to forgive the amount so that it does not have to get repaid. They've got some other language they use in the FAQ, but they have documented that for us.
Okay, are there any other trailing questions, Stan?
I'm not seeing any. We should wrap it up before anybody else jumps in, so we can at least give them 5 minutes.
Okay. Well, on behalf of the Office of Block Grant Assistance at HUD, I would also like to thank everyone for their attendance today. We do urge you to check out the resources that are listed on this slide, which Stan went over. You also will want to visit the conference website and look at the resources webpage, where there are the 2 resources that I'd mentioned, together with the quick guide that Stan referenced, along with other resources. We would urge you to look through the HUD Exchange for those specific questions that you might have. If there are questions, for example, around job training or retrofitting businesses, you will find that a lot of specific guidance is actually will appear in the frequently asked questions, the FAQs around CDBG-CV. So we urge you to look at those available resources and view this virtual CARES Act conference as really a jumping off place where you can learn more and arrive at better strategies to manage your programs, and even consider the possibility of co-managing CDBG-CV and DR. So with that, we will say we hope you have a nice weekend, and goodbye.
And thanks for joining us on a Friday at 4.
Indeed.